When I first drove Mazda's brand new electric vehicle a number of months ago, I thought to myself, this is a perfect landing at the wrong airport. Other reviewers have been a little bit less kind and said that this is an EV after its time. Of course, according to Mazda, the MX-30 is the perfect commuter car for Californians. This is on sale only in California at this time. Who's right? Where does the truth lie? I borrowed one for a week to find out. The first thing to address is, what is the MX-30? And I apologize in advance if I accidentally call this a CX-30 at any point in this video. The MX-30 is basically an electrified CX-30, but they didn't simply drop in an electric motor under the hood like we find in, for instance, a Hyundai Kona EV or a Kia Niro EV, where the EV and the plug-in hybrid and the hybrid all look alike. Instead, Mazda used the platform from the CX-30, but they gave it a new skin, new doors, and a completely different interior. So really, only under the skin is anything shared with the CX-30. Mazda designed this as a short-range EV. It has an EPA range of 100 miles, meaning it's really targeted at someone that drives 50 miles a day or less. On occasion, you could drive the full 100 miles absolutely without a problem, but to keep it in the safe window, ideal target is 30 to 50 miles, even according to Mazda. This is also a relatively inexpensive EV. If you qualify for the full $7,500 federal tax credit, and most EV buyers tend to, the price tag of this will effectively drop down to around $26,000 or $27,000, depending on which additional state and local incentives you qualify for. That is a pretty inexpensive EV, much less expensive than, say, a Tesla Model 3 or a Tesla Model Y, which are absolutely not competitors to the MX-30. If you want 300 miles of range, you should buy a Tesla. If you want something with all the latest bells and whistles that Tesla offers, obviously buy a Tesla. If, on the other hand, you're looking for a pragmatic EV, that's where the MX-30 comes in. Also, obviously, you should get the MX-30 if you like the styling, and I do love the front-end look. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. If American car shoppers were a pragmatic bunch, myself included, we would all be driving around to work in vehicles like the MX-30. 100 miles of range is enough for me to do my daily commute in. This will seat 5 people. It has 4 doors technically, although the back doors here are suicide doors. You have to open the front doors, then you can open the back doors. This is a subcompact crossover. It's almost exactly the same size as the CX-30 on which it's based. But they decided to style the rear end to look a little bit different. So it has this two-tone roof going on here, sort of a satin chrome stripe right there separating the two, and it definitely has a different look than the CX-30. I have to admit that as much as I like the front end design, I kind of wish that the side had really just been the CX-30. The rear end design is distinctively Mazda, and we have full LED taillights, which is a really nice touch. A lot of vehicles in this price category have combination LED tail lamps. So the brake lights are LEDs, but the turn signals and the backup lights are incandescent. These are all LEDs, so it gives the modules a slimmer, cleaner, more elegant look. Be sure and let me know what you think about the looks of the MX-30 down there in the comment section. As much as I wish this had the rear doors from the CX-30 for improved rear passenger practicality, I love the look. And I think this ties with the Mini SE for being the most attractive small EV in America. The Mini SE is an interesting competitor, which we'll talk about at the end of the video, because it's really the closest to this in terms of a pragmatic small city EV. What do I mean by a pragmatic EV? Well, when you take a look at the cutaway of the CX-30, it's clear that Mazda could have put a higher capacity battery in this vehicle if they'd wanted to, and they simply chose not to. Admittedly, this could not have had a battery as big as the one in the Mustang Mach-E or a Hyundai Ionic 5, but it's also clear based on the drawings and cutaways that I've seen that a bigger battery would have fit. Say 150 miles, maybe even 200 miles of range if Mazda had really tried. Why didn't they? Well, that is based really on 2 decisions from Mazda. First, the practical reality that the average American doesn't drive more than 100 miles a day, so a 100-mile range EV would make an awful lot of sense. For the amount of battery on board in a long-range Mach-E, you could build 3 MX-30s. And again, the average person doesn't drive 300 miles a day. So why are you dragging around an enormous battery pack all the time when you don't need it? And you will definitely notice that in the way the MX-30 drives. It is definitely swifter than some of the bigger battery pack EVs with not too much more power than we find in this vehicle. It also handles and rides better as a result of the smaller battery pack. The problem is, as pragmatic and practical as the MX-30 is, the shoppers, the people that are buying EVs right now in America, they're not overly pragmatic. If you like the look of the MX-30, but you really want more than 100 miles of range, then that MX-30 is coming a little bit later. And that's why under the hood we have this big open area right next to the 143 horsepower electric motor. This is where a range extending module is going to go a little bit later in 2022. Now, Mazda is calling this a plug-in hybrid technically on their website, but whether you want to call it a range extending EV or a plug-in hybrid, it appears to be basically the same thing. It's going to be a generator module with an engine and an electric generator. The electric motor over here is still going to be the only thing powering the wheels. So in that respect, it's going to be a little bit more like the BMW i3 with the range extender than something like a Chevy Volt. In the MX-30 with the range extending option, the engine is only going to be providing electricity to the motor, which is then going to be driving the wheels forward. There are no details just yet on that range extending option, but it's very clear that this vehicle was designed with that range extender in mind. Charging happens back here on the passenger side, where we find a standard J1772 port and a CCS DC fast charge port. If you DC fast charge this, the DC fast charge speed is capped at about 50 kilowatts, so this is not any faster than a Chevy Bolt as far as DC fast charge speeds go. But the battery is relatively small, so it doesn't take a whole lot of time to go from 10% to 80%. Just keep in mind, you're not going to be getting too many miles going from 10% to 80%. That about 43 to 45 minutes is going to give you about 70 miles of range. The EVSE that Mazda includes with the MX-30 has a nice rugged cord and a nice long cord at that, but it is just a 12 amp 120 volt EVSE, so a level 1 charger. I would really have loved to see Mazda include the MX-30 with a dual voltage charger, even if it was, say, rated at 20 amps 240 volts. That would have dropped the charging time on the included EVSE from approximately 30 hours down to 12. Or more rationally, for the average person out there that's only using half the battery a day, it would only take about 6 hours at night to top the battery up completely full if they'd included that kind of EVSE with the vehicle. That's something that we're starting to see in other EVs out there, and I really wish that Mazda would update the MX-30 simply with a new EVSE. It might be a game of semantics, but Mazda in their press release calls the MX-30 a commuter car, not a city car, although I think it's actually well adapted to both. The one problem for a potential urban buyer of the MX-30 is that very often people that live in downtown LA or downtown San Francisco only have one car, and a vehicle with just 100 miles of range might be a little bit tricky if you suddenly decide you want to drive to San Diego one day. For people in that situation, however, Mazda does have an answer for you. They will give you a loaner Mazda for 10 days a year for the first 3 years of ownership. So you have 30 days of driving some other Mazda vehicle if you do want to go on a longer road trip. Bearing in mind that it's not really possible to drive the MX-30 for more than about 2 to 2.5 hours at a time, I found the front seats to be quite comfortable. The driver's seat has a two-way adjustable lumbar support, which I really appreciate, and we have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a really long range of motion. Also, the front doors open really, really wide because we have the suicide door back here that makes it easier to get in and out of. If you live in rural America, that is, where you can just fling a door open and you don't have to worry at all. If, on the other hand, you live in suburbia or urban areas, then it could be a little bit tricky to actually use the rear doors here, because you do have to do this sort of do-si-do dance here with the two doors. And as you can see, really in this position to try and even get through there, it's pretty much wider than the average suburban mall parking lot, so it could be a little bit tricky to actually use these rear doors. If, on the other hand, you can use the rear doors in this way, then it's easier to get in the back seat than you might think, based on just the legroom figures for the MX-30. In the transition from CX-30 to MX-30, this vehicle lost a reasonable amount of legroom, and I'm not entirely clear why, but you will definitely notice that back here. With this front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have about an inch of legroom left, and I could sit back here if I needed to. The roof line is pretty upright, so I have a decent amount of headroom. For the rear passenger, the door opening is a little bit tricky, however, and that's all because Mazda wanted to give this good side impact protection, but they also wanted to give it this suicide door arrangement that ends up being a little bit less practical for the rear passengers, especially if you wanted to put kids back here and they needed assistance to get in and out of child seats. You will find a little bit more passenger room in the back of a Leaf or a Nero, but versus something like the Mini SE, this has a much more comfortable middle seat here. And even though my head is definitely digging into the ceiling a little bit, this is definitely more comfortable than that Mini. One odd twist that I continue to see here is that on the back of the driver's seat, we have buttons to power move the driver's seat forward and backward. And in case you're wondering, yes, it even works when the vehicle is on, in gear, in drive, with the seat belt fastened and all the doors closed. I don't know about you, but if I were a kid, I would be constantly pressing my dad's buttons, quite literally, because I think this is absolutely hilarious. Behind the hatch, we find 21 cubic feet of cargo capacity, which is interestingly a little bit more than we find in the gasoline CX-30. That puts this sort of mid-pack as far as inexpensive EVs go. You can see that I could put a 22-inch roller bag in this upright position. I could put about 3 of them across the back, perhaps 4, and I could also lay one right there in front. As far as inexpensive EVs go, this is a little bit less capacity than you'll find in a Nissan Leaf, but more than you'll find in some of the Hyundai and Kia inexpensive options. Under the load floor, we have a bunch of foam dividers and a little bit of lost opportunity, I would say, for additional storage space. This is where we find the can of fix-a-flat and the tow hook for the vehicle. If I remove this foam divider, this is also where we find the Bose subwoofer that's on this particular trim. You can see that there is a reasonable amount of room around there. There are also some additional storage slots right there. If I remove this back foam piece, this is where we find the onboard level 1 and level 2 charger. As we look around the interior, you should know that this is the fully loaded version, not the base version. So we have a moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. The front passenger seat is approximately in the same position as the driver's seat, so as you can see, because of the way the doors are arranged, you're sort of looking at that pillar right there and the shoulder belt when you're looking to the side of the vehicle. You can see the relatively small size of that rear door and the fact that the rear passengers are mainly looking at that small side window there, then they have that large piece of body right there next to it. Mazda's really proud of the fact that this interior is full of recycled, recyclable, and renewable components, so we don't find the same sort of upholstery that we find in other Mazda models. On the doors, for instance, we have an interesting felt-like material on the upper section of the door and on the lower section of the door right there. And all of these materials have a really premium feel to them. You may not be a fan of the style, but I would say that compared to vehicles like the Mini SE, the seat fabric and the door materials actually feel a little bit more premium in here. Moving over to the dashboard, the style is very much like other recent Mazda models with this large infotainment screen right here in the middle of the dashboard. This is not a touchscreen. It's only controllable via the infotainment controller lower in the dashboard. We have an injection molded dashboard there, large air vents running right there across that large center section. I do find it interesting that Mazda allows you to have a touchscreen here, but not one up there. This is probably something that we're going to see in other upcoming Mazda models. It's devoted primarily to the climate control system, although it's logical that there may be other features integrated into that screen at some later date. Behind and under that LCD, we find a very large storage compartment. It is cork-lined. It's accessible from both sides. This is where we find the USB interface ports for the infotainment system, some charge ports. There's a 12-volt port right up there. You see that little tiny cigarette lighter port right there. And then there's a little bit of storage on either side as well. On the upside of that, we have a slightly different shifter than we find in other Mazda models. It goes over to the right and then down there for drive. Reverse is all the way up. Park is over to the left there. We have the same infotainment controller that we find in other Mazda models, an auto brake hold button there, electric parking brake. This knob over here is for volume, power, and track forward, backward. There's also a favorite button right over there. Then we have another storage area also lined in cork. These flip up to give us access to the cup holders. I have to say, I really like the look and the feel of the cork on this interior. I want to see how well this ages, however. Between the front seats, we have a padded center armrest that opens to reveal a very small storage cubby right there. This does slide forward and backward to give you a better position on that armrest. On the driver's side, there's an available full-color heads-up display. It's projected on the windscreen, not on a sheet of plastic like we found in earlier Mazda models. I apologize for that looking blurry. It actually is sharp in person, but these are very difficult to film. Below that, we find a partial LCD instrument cluster. The design is pretty similar to other Mazda models, where we have an approximately 7-inch LCD right there in the middle that gives us basically our speedometer, trip computer readouts, things like that. On the left side of that, we have a physical charge and power dial. On the right side, we have battery level and battery temperature. Now you'll notice the battery right now is about 51%. This vehicle has just gone from my office to my house. It's consumed 49% of its battery. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The steering wheel is basically the same one that we find in other Mazda models. There's some sport grips up top and then paddles on the back. These are regen braking paddles, which I love. If you click the paddle on the right side of the steering wheel, that decreases the amount of regen you get. If you click the one on the left side of the paddle, you get more regen. They're pretty well hidden right there behind the spokes. Regen braking is adjustable in 5 different steps. That's something that I wish every EV had. On the right side of the wheel over here, we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system. And then on the left side, we have the controls for the infotainment system, along with the voice command button and some dedicated phone buttons. If you didn't know it already, there is a correlation between battery pack size in terms of capacity and in terms of number of cells, and the amount of power that the pack can dissipate, the amount of power it can give you to power the electric motor. The pack design in this vehicle is likely the reason that power output is rated to just over 140 horsepower. If this had a bigger battery pack, it could put out more power, it could give you more oomph. There is a reason that high horsepower, quick accelerating EVs have bigger battery packs and longer range. There's definitely a connection there. As a result, 0 to 60 happened in this model in 8.7 seconds. That's pretty similar to a wide variety of compact and subcompact crossovers. So this is right in line with the gasoline competition. But it is a little bit slower than some other EVs that you might want to be considering, just due to the design of this EV drivetrain. Mazda has not said whether the upcoming plug-in hybrid version of the MX-30 is going to get a more powerful electric motor. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a very minor bump to help compensate for the increased weight of that range extending system. 60 to 0 stopping distance in this model happened in 129 feet. That is on the long side for EVs, and I think that has to do with the tire size. Mazda's mission with the MX-30 was to make this lightweight, make it efficient, and make it, again, very practical. And for them, that meant putting 215 width tires in the vehicle. That does affect the stopping distance and the handling score of the vehicle, but it also helps improve efficiency. Of course, thanks to the smaller battery pack, the curb weight is not as high as many of the competitive EVs, so this doesn't need wider tires to feel similar to some of those other EVs. In fact, I would say as far as base handling goes, this has a better sorted feel to it than the base version of the Mach-E. Thanks to the battery pack positioning in the MX-30, this has a really good weight balance, so it definitely has a solid, sorted, stable feel to it out on the road. The ground clearance is a little bit lower than in the CX-30, and the center of gravity is a lot lower, so this definitely has a pleasing feel to it, even though it's front-wheel drive. This is not going to be quite as much fun as, say, a Volkswagen ID4 or that Mach-E or a Hyundai Ionic that's rear-wheel drive starting, but the difference is a little bit smaller than you might think. And of course, if you live in an area with inclement weather, with snow, etc., front-wheel drive is going to be preferred because of the traction benefit that you get. When it comes to handling, I'm going to give this an A-. It definitely has a good solid feel to it, but it gives up a little bit in terms of grip to some of the competition. Out on a rougher road like the road that I'm on here, the MX-30 rides very much like the rest of the Mazda lineup, which is to say, a little on the firm side for a mainstream regular gasoline vehicle, but this drives more like a gasoline vehicle, or feels more like a gasoline vehicle like this out on a rougher road. It doesn't have that firm and bouncy feel that we find in so many big battery EVs out there, from Tesla to the Mach-E, etc. And that likely all has to do with the curb weight, the small battery pack in here, and the way that Mazda has designed the suspension. Again, Mazda says the MX-30 was designed as a commuter vehicle, and for a vehicle that I would spend an hour, perhaps an hour and a half in every day, this is definitely going to be more comfortable in terms of ride quality than the Mustang Mach-E. Back out on the paved road, the ride quality is still excellent. This soaks up small imperfections and large imperfections very well, and again, it lacks that bouncy feel that we find in so many big battery EVs. As a result, I'm going to give this an A when it comes to ride quality. In terms of cabin quietness, at 50 miles an hour, I measured 71.5 decibels, so I'm also going to give this an A. Driving this back-to-back with a CX-30, this is a little bit quieter, and I credit the battery pack for that. Remember, there is a pretty large battery pack between the cabin and the road, and that definitely helps isolate the cabin a little bit compared to the gasoline-only version. In terms of range and efficiency, the MX-30 appears to be punching a little bit above its weight. In my real-world range test, I got 105 miles of range out of this battery. That's a 5% improvement over what the EPA says. That puts this in a category actually quite similar in terms of efficiency to some of the most efficient Tesla models out there. Of course, this is absolutely not a Tesla Model 3 competitor. I'm just using that as an example as far as efficiency. Tesla really does have incredible efficiency in a lot of their latest vehicles. As you'd probably expect out of Mazda, when the road starts winding, this feels very much like every other Mazda out there. There's definitely a little bit of body roll, there's a little bit of tip and dive. It's not overly firmly sprung like you'd expect out of a European performance vehicle, but it has a very pleasing feel to it and a very directly connected steering rack. Mazda really does well when it comes to steering feedback and steering precision. This is just about perfect as far as steering for a vehicle that's relatively inexpensive. And actually, honestly, I would say that the steering in this feels better than the steering feel that we find in a Ford Mustang Mach-E or even a Tesla Model 3. This just has a good connected feel to it, and it really is easy to drive the MX-30 hard. That's something that we see in other Mazdas. Of course, when it comes to absolute grip, this is not going to hold the road as well as some of those other performance EVs out there, obviously those Teslas included, but for the handling score, and for me at least, it's more than just about a grip number. It's about connection to the vehicle, the way the vehicle feels, etc. And Mazda has done an excellent job with the MX-30. Really, my only complaint with the MX-30 is the range, and that's something that Mazda could fix if they wanted to. Whether they want to or not, that's an open-ended question. Of course, I wouldn't be surprised if the plug-in hybrid version of the MX-30 ended up being like the BMW i3, where you got 100 miles of EV range and 100 miles of gasoline range. If a range-extending EV has a shorter range on gasoline than it does on electric, the manufacturer gets more zero-emissions credits. And that's why the BMW i3 range extender was limited in that way in the United States. I wouldn't be surprised if Mazda did that with the MX-30, but again, we don't know any details about that just yet. It could end up like a Chevy Volt, where it gives you 400 or 500 miles of range, the first 100 or so on electricity, and the rest on gasoline. If they do that, I would say the MX-30 would become a very, very interesting car. Now let's talk about how the MX-30 is priced. Mazda did do a really good job making sure that there's a ton of standard equipment on the base model, but it is a little bit more expensive than some of the direct competition. It starts at $33,470 plus destination, but minus tax credits and additional local incentives. In California, some of those incentives have started to reduce, so we now have about $750 off for most folks out there. If you are within a certain income bracket, then you may qualify for an additional incentive. However, if you're in some of those tax brackets, then you may not qualify for the full federal tax credit, so it's probably going to come out in the wash. If you qualify for the maximum federal tax credit and the $750 off in California, it could be as low as $25,000 to $26,000. You should also know that there are some reasonable deals going on the MX-30, and currently it is the least expensive Mazda to lease in the United States. And I expect that to continue because Mazda needs to move some zero-emissions vehicles for the credits in California, and that's logically why the MX-30 exists at the moment and why it's sold only in California. The problem in my head is that the MX-30 is a perfectly fine EV. I have actually owned an electric vehicle with 100 miles of range. I had a 2016 Kia Soul. I had it for 3 years. And for me, the 100 miles of range was occasionally a problem, but it worked fairly well, to be perfectly honest. And I had a 60-mile-a-day commute one way back then. I drove it 60 miles to the office, I charged it at the office, then I drove it 60 miles back home and charged it at home, and it wasn't really a problem. It did, however, become a problem occasionally when you did need to stretch those bounds, and then you would need to stop and DC fast charge. And I mentioned the Kia Soul EV because its range is oddly similar to this MX-30. The interior size is oddly similar to the MX-30 as well, and the charge rates haven't really changed too much, that 2016 model to this 2022 MX-30. Of course, the other problem is that the competition hasn't stayed still, so let's dive into that now. I think the biggest problem, if you're simply looking for an inexpensive commuter car, is the Nissan Leaf. It is an inexpensive commuter car. Yes, the battery is air-cooled, it's not liquid-cooled. Yes, it's not exactly the most attractive EV out there, but it is large and practical on the inside, the seats are comfortable, and they have updated it time after time in order to help keep it current. The big thing is it starts a lot less expensive. $27,400 is the base price. That is significantly less expensive. There are even greater incentives over at the Nissan dealer also in order to get you into a Leaf. It will go 50% further on a charge as well because the battery is bigger. And that's a big deal for a lot of folks. It gives you a little extra cushion so you're not going to need to charge the battery fully all the time. That'll help improve battery life if you plan on buying the vehicle. And it's just going to make it more convenient if something doesn't go quite right in your day. Say the charger at the office is broken or it's occupied, it gives you a little bit of extra cushion. It also gives you cushion if you live in an area with a bit more of a temperature swing from summer to winter than we get here in Northern California. So say you're in Atlanta or something like that, you want to use the air conditioning more during the summer, and during the winter you may need to use the heater more. It's going to give you that extra cushion. On the downside, handling isn't quite as nice. Power level is pretty similar, but the big problem for me is the CHAdeMO DC fast charge connector. This is the only vehicle in the United States currently on sale that uses that older DC fast charge standard. Oddly enough, the Kia Soul EV that I used to own was the other one. Everybody else has moved over to the CCS standard except for Tesla, of course, but even Tesla appears to be going that direction with some of their adapters and some of the vehicles that we see on sale in Europe. Electrify America is really the other DC fast charging network in the United States other than Tesla's network that's really focused on interstate long distance travel, and they don't support the CHAdeMO connector. Next up, we have the Mini Cooper SE. This, I think, is really similar to the MX-30 because they're both very style forward vehicles, they're both fun to drive. On the surface of things, the Mini appears to be one of the least expensive EVs in the US, starting at $29,900, but there are a number of options available, and it will really end up in about the same price range as the MX-30 when you've started to price it comparably to the Mazda. You get a lot less standard equipment in the Mini Cooper SE by the time you add those options, it's basically going to be the same. It ends up at $37,400 fully equipped, so right in the same ballpark as the MX-30 that I was driving. You get a slight bump in range, 114 miles, so again, you get a little extra cushion if that's something that you're interested in, and I do think that the Mini Cooper is pretty fun to drive as well. Now, on the downside, the Mini Cooper is not as spacious on the inside. It's only a two-door vehicle. Even though the rear suicide doors aren't exactly my thing, they are definitely more practical than not having that door at all. There's also more cargo room available in the MX-30. Other than that, they're pretty similar. They'll both charge at the same rate when you connect it to a DC fast charger. They use the same DC fast charge connector, and they'll charge at about the same rate when you connect them to an AC Level 2 connector as well. Next up, we have the Hyundai Ionic, and I'm not talking about the Ionic 5, I'm talking about their previous generation electric vehicle, the plain old Ionic. This probably is not long for the world because there is going to be a base standard range version of the Ionic 5 at some point. So if you want the latest version of Hyundai's electric car, you're going to want the Ionic 5 in standard range when it comes a little bit later this year. If you want the less expensive version, it's likely going to be the Ionic Electric. You get 70% more range than we find in the MX-30. It's 170 miles of total range for $33,245. If you're interested in extra range, that base version is a pretty good deal, and it looks like you're going to get a better deal on it on the Hyundai dealer lot than you will on the MX-30 on the Mazda dealer lot. You do get a little bit less power, 134 horsepower, but 0 to 60 performance is honestly pretty similar. Now, the MX-30 definitely looks like a small crossover, albeit kind of a funky crossover from the side. The Ionic is perhaps a little bit more traditional. It really looks like an electric Prius, I guess you could say. It has that very same profile as a Prius because it's also a liftback or a sportback. Now, that means that it's just about as practical in terms of cargo carrying capacity as the MX-30. The rear seats fold down. You can put very large items on the inside, but it is styled a little bit differently. It has a different vibe to it. What about if you want to step up into the next tier of modern EVs? Say something like the Volkswagen ID4. That starts at $40,760, and it's quite a different vehicle. This is definitely a more modern EV. And the MX-30 feels like it's in the same sort of ballpark as the original Ionic and some of those other EVs that came out maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. The ID4, on the other hand, is trying to be an electric RAV4 or an electric Tiguan. It's one full size larger than the MX-30, and it certainly feels that on the inside and on the outside. But it's priced relatively well. It starts at $40,760 for 2022. Now, that is more expensive than the absolute top-end version of the MX-30, and you won't find all the same kind of standard feature content in that base ID4. But on the other hand, you do get 260 miles of range. That is well more than double the range that we find in the MX-30. And you get 3 years of unlimited DC fast charging. So if you live near an Electrify America station, that's the only network that DC fast charging applies on, I should say, the free DC fast charging that is, then you can charge your ID4 for free anytime you want, unlimited for that first 3 years. So if you were so inclined, you could pay nothing for the electricity for that time period. It's also more powerful and dynamically different. The MX-30 is a front-wheel drive vehicle. The ID4 is rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. So if you did want all-wheel drive in your next EV, you can do that in the ID4. You can't in the MX-30. The standard motor is 201 horsepower. The optional one is around 300 horsepower. The other thing, again, is DC fast charging happens faster, 125 kW. That's more than double the rate that we find in the MX-30. So again, it's going to gain range faster. But probably the most important thing to remember about the ID4, or really any of the other EVs currently on sale in the US, is that they're going to be more expensive than the MX-30. Are they going to be better? Are they going to give you better range, etc.? Absolutely. But are they going to cost you more? Also, absolutely. And as you start talking about longer range EVs like a Ford Mustang Mach-E at 207 or 300 miles, or a Tesla Model 3 or a Tesla Model Y, that price delta just grows and grows and grows. If you're interested in 300 miles of range, obviously this is not the EV for you. But if you're looking for an affordable, cheeky, stylish crossover, whatever you want to call this thing, as a commuter vehicle, then the MX-30 could make a decent amount of sense. The question is, does it make more sense than a Mini Cooper SE, or a Hyundai Ionic, or even a Nissan Leaf? That is awfully tricky, and I would say at this point in time, no. I would probably buy a Nissan Leaf or a Mini Cooper or a Hyundai Ionic before I bought the MX-30 at this point in time. If I was really looking for a cheap commuter car, that would be the Nissan Leaf. It is far and away the least expensive EV out there, and it's perfectly serviceable. Definitely has longer range as well. If I wanted to spend a little bit more, then I probably would get the Ionic. I think it's a really great deal. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Now, as sort of mediocre as I feel about this MX-30, I am truly excited for the plug-in hybrid version when it comes out, because not too many car companies are really interested in giving you a longer range plug-in hybrid. Till now, most of them stop around 30, 40 miles or so. If you really treated an older Volt or a Honda Clarity really nicely, you could get about 50 miles of range out of them. But if Mazda sticks with about the same size battery in the plug-in version of the MX-30 and puts a gasoline engine and range extender in there, then you could get 100 miles, which is really a very livable amount of daily EV range, and you'd have that security of having gasoline on board when you need it. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and of course, be sure and check out the EV channel, EV Buyer's Guide. There's a link down there in the description as well, and I'll see all of you next week.